everyone, and welcome to Learn TV channel. I'm Mimi, and today via Zoom, we're welcoming our new guest, Waqar Rizvi, a multilingual broadcast news journalist and media consultant with over 15 years of on-air experience. He will share with us the latest insights into digital media and its effects on journalism. Waqar, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you for having me, Mimi. It's a pleasure to be here.
The word media applies to many things in the 21st century, including the many emerging forms of digital media. Let's start with defining what digital media and journalism are and how they have changed during the years.
Let me start with journalism, right? Journalism is basically how we gather news, how we assess the news, how we present the news. And this can be, as I'm speaking to you right now, on video or through audio, podcasts, etc., or otherwise, even through print media. And digital media is, of course, then a step forward when it comes in that journalism process, if we're talking specifically about journalism, and that is how then we use new media, be it social media or other new technologies to then, how we present journalism overall. Digital media by itself, of course, just means new technology, essentially, and how then human beings interact with that digital media and that new media, and how we present things to each other via digital media as well.
How does the digital media environment affect journalism?
Well, it affects journalism a lot because, now that we're using social media, especially, and on that front, certainly, we have a lot more people who claim to be journalists online, right? So we have people who are not trained, who don't actually do their proper due diligence when it comes to checking if sources are correct, if news that they're posting about is correct. That's one aspect of digital journalism. But the other aspect is also then how new technology is helping journalists. So the fact that we have encrypted messaging, be it Telegram or other such forms of apps where you can send secret messages and receive secret messages from your sources, which are encrypted and no one can trace, that's also a very important part of the journalism process. So, there's been a lot of good which has happened with digital media and how it's been able to help journalism. But at the same time, we have a lot of fake news as well, or a lot of news that is simply not being checked properly enough because we have a lot of amateur journalists as well in the world.
A new problem social media has created is too much news. The audience can't always figure out the veracity of the news they see on social media. How do journalists establish the legitimacy of their sources?
Yeah, and this is always tough. There is no way to do it which is always 100%. But the ways to do it are pretty basic, as I said already. You reach out to a source through some encrypted message if they are scared of revealing their identity. If that's not an issue, if their identity can be revealed, you still need to check with at least 3 sources on average, depending on if you're able to find 3 sources. Now, obviously, whenever something is presented and if something goes wrong, then you should always point out that it went wrong. And that is responsible journalism, to admit when something goes wrong. That's what the issue is right now about how, as I mentioned already, digital media creates the situation where you have a whole bunch of people online who can even fake videos. I mean, nowadays we have deep fakes, we have videos which can be edited, and this is happening even during the current situation that we can talk about around the world as well, with the many conflicts. So that's a huge challenge for journalists as well as for people who are reading, viewing, or listening to news.
The fake news phenomenon makes reporting more challenging than ever. How can journalists recognize fake news and what precautions can they take in order to avoid them?
Yeah, and this goes back to my previous answer as well, right? So fake news, especially when we're a journalist, happens to us. It's happened to me as well, where I've read something and my first thought is that makes sense or that might have happened. But then sometimes when I do the research and I start looking for other websites or other sources that might be saying that, and I don't find it, then sometimes I will wait and see. So I think that that's really important for journalists to remember, and for even people who are reading news to remember that if you're only reading that news or listening to that news or watching that news from one source, that usually means that you should probably wait and see if this is true or not before claiming that it is completely true. So sometimes it's not always about being number one or the first one who comes out with the news, but it's sometimes more important to actually wait and to ensure that the news that you are talking about is the correct one. And again, this goes for journalists as well as for those people who are watching news or listening to news.
which news organizations should they trust?
That's a tricky question, Mimi, because I don't think that there is any one news organization anyone should completely trust. And I say this as a journalist who works for news organizations and has worked with news organizations, but the reality is that we always need to be careful because as journalists, we are also human beings, and the news organizations we work with are also made up of human beings, and we make mistakes sometimes. Every news organization also, it's really important to remember, has their own agenda as well. So you always need to be very careful. And that's why I always tell people, when people tell me, oh, we only watch this channel or that channel, or we only read this newspaper or that newspaper, I always tell them, listen, you should actually be reading two opposite newspapers or two opposite channels you should be watching. So one which is telling you X and the other one which is telling you Y, and then you should yourself as a human being decide what you believe is the truth.
Of course, people will continue trusting the big news agencies they have always trusted. But what about the next generation? Are there any technologies available out there in order to determine source reliability?
Source reliability, there's many ways to do it, right? So as I said, that there is an issue with deep fakes right now. And I'm just going to use that as an example because there are many issues surrounding deep fakes, A, and B, how videos are edited. And this is becoming a huge issue where you can show a picture or a video and not talk about the proper context of that video or that picture. So for example, basic things like if you find a video or a picture, let me use that as a better example. If you find a picture online and somebody is claiming that it is in some other country, you can easily do a Google image search. And that will then show you the real location of where that original picture was taken, hopefully, if that is able to be found online. And that's one of the very easy issues. I mean, obviously, journalists, we have other forms of more in-depth ways of researching if something is true or not. But for the average person, those sorts of tools are the best. And as I said already, it's always best to not immediately accept something that you are seeing until you do your own research. Don't just accept everything somebody tells you.
Is there a way to raise awareness on what we as a society can do to avoid from falling into the trap of fake news?
It's just about becoming more literate when it comes to media. And it's just about realizing also that all media, as I already said, has an agenda. So if you realize those two things and you realize that you need to also be a responsible citizen of the world, even as somebody who is just observing media and doesn't even work in media, but nevertheless, because you can pass that information on to somebody else and that information can be wrong, you don't want to be responsible for incorrect information getting into someone's minds. That is why we have so much of this, sort of hatred on any side, really, if we talk about it. And the reason is because there's so much misinformation out there. There's so much fake news. There's so much exaggeration of news, and that needs to stop.
Are there any positive effects that digital media has on the journalism?
Yes. So one example I already told you about is the encryption of messaging, right? And that helps us a lot because there are many sources who sometimes their lives are in danger. So they cannot talk to us on record. They can't have their names, but yet they can't even sometimes message us directly because that will also put them in danger because their governments might be following their messages online. So encrypted messages are a very, very good form of digital media and have been a really good advancement of digital media. But even beyond that, I mean, just the fact that you're able to interact with people from around the world very easily through different means and different apps, as well as I mentioned already, the use of many different websites to check if videos, pictures are correct. The fact that you can search on the internet very easily for facts as well to check if the fact that somebody is telling you is correct or not. All of those things really help journalists because they make us, or they should help us at least, ensure that whatever information we're giving to the public is checked, and then that is when we are being released. That is when we're releasing the information.
What about the issue of the digital divide? Can you tell us more about that?
And that's a huge issue. And I'm glad you brought that up, Mimi, because, everywhere in the world right now, we have people like you and I, possibly, who have a lot of access to digital media. We have access to mobiles. We have access to all the apps around the world, which we can use to verify things, to read the news even. But there are a lot of people who don't even have access to basic mobile phones, right? So I'm talking about people who don't have access to even smartphones. They have access to maybe the most basic mobile phones and the ones with the touch pads, basically. And beyond that, also, then we have a huge issue with literacy or even digital literacy. So even if you have access to the internet or a computer or a mobile, many times you don't actually know how to use that properly. And that, of course, we can see is a generational divide as well, but that is mainly actually a class divide or a divide across the world, depending on basically how much money you have, if we're completely honest, and where you lie on the class system around the world. That is a huge issue, because then that means that there are many people who cannot then move up in life until they learn new digital skills or until they become literate digitally. And that is a humongous issue for even developing countries, but even in developed countries, it's an issue sometimes of affordability as well.
Can journalism help economically marginalized populations get access to information?
It can, yes, in certain circumstances, Mimi. But of course, we have to remember that when there is economic marginalization, there's a reason for that. And many of those reasons are political sometimes. And so that means that some form of information is probably also being suppressed in such a country or place. And therefore, you many times will have journalists who are too scared to report on the truth. So this doesn't always help in that case. But it's also then a case of then other journalists from outside the country who are then reporting on what's happening inside that country that then can help that situation as well. So when you have realization of the truth about corruption, for example, then you can have a people who will stand up and say, okay, this is wrong and we cannot accept this anymore.
What is your forecast for the next decade? What should modern journalists be on the lookout for?
I think, it'll be harder and harder to tell the truth from a lie. And that's always been the case for journalism, but it used to be easier because then you could trust people to tell you the truth when you would reach out to sources. Now we have so much bias and so much prejudice in news even, and we have people who are so partisan on one side or the other that it's very hard to tell if this person is telling you the truth. And that will, like I said, with technology, it will only become harder because technology, as I mentioned, deep fakes can take any politician's face and make them say things which they haven't actually said, can take a video and edit it in such a way that it shows something which didn't actually happen. So those issues will be long-standing issues. And I think those are only going to get much worse in the coming years.
Thank you, Waqar, for your input and for being part of today's episode. It was a real pleasure to have you in the show.
Thank you for having me, Mimi. It was good speaking to you as well.
Dear viewers, thank you as well for tuning in. In case there is something you missed, you can always watch a recording on our YouTube channel. Feel free to share with us any topics that you want to have them discussed in our show. You can write us a message or a comment and we'll review them with our content team. Feel free to join us in LinkedIn Live for a new topic every day. Until next time, stay tuned.